They called him the architect of silence, a man who owned the police, the judges, and the shadows of Seoul. Lee Sung-hoon didn't have weaknesses, or so everyone thought. But on a bitter December night at the most exclusive gala of the year, the world discovered his only vulnerability: his mother. As the city's elite watched a cruel socialite force the confused elderly woman to her knees, Sung-hoon did something terrified onlookers didn't expect. He waited. He watched. He remained motionless on the mezzanine balcony, his expression carved from stone, until a girl with a wine-stained uniform and nothing to lose stepped between the predator and the prey. This is the story of how a $28 an hour maid saved the soul of a monster. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel in Seoul's Gangnam district reeked of new money pretending to be old money, of designer fragrances so expensive they became invisible, and of something darker underneath, the unmistakable scent of unspoken violence. It was the annual Winter Solstice Charity Gala, an elaborate masquerade where the city's predators played saints and the truly dangerous men observed from the shadows. Crystal chandeliers weighing as much as small cars cast a fractured golden light across 300 guests, each one holding flutes of champagne they'd never finish. Orchestral music drifted through air thick with cigar smoke and ambition. Beneath the glittering surface, deals were being made, debts were being noted, power was being redistributed in the careful, invisible ways that shaped Seoul's underworld. High above the ballroom floor, on the shadowed mezzanine balcony reserved for the most powerful men in the city, Lee Sung-hoon stood like a gargoyle carved from obsidian and silence. He was 42 years old, though his face carried the ageless quality of someone who had seen too much and forgotten nothing. His dark navy suit was bespoke, tailored to fit the precise geometry of his broad shoulders, cut by a man in Milan who worked only for clients who understood discretion. His white dress shirt was immaculate. His dark eyes scanned the ballroom floor with the predatory focus of a shark moving through shallow water. He didn't drink. He didn't smile. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket with methodical precision, a gesture that had become his only tell, a signal to those who knew him that he was calculating something. To the public, Lee Sung-hoon was a logistics magnate, a man whose international trading company moved goods across continents. To the underworld, he was simply the architect. He built empires with the same efficiency he demolished his enemies. The Korean-Chinese syndicates feared him. The smaller families paid him tribute disguised as consulting fees. The police left him alone because he had purchased their silence long ago. But none of that mattered tonight. "Sir," his head of security, a massive man named Kim Tae-oh, whispered into the concealed earpiece, "Your mother has wandered from the VIP table again. Nurse Hopkins is searching for her." Lee Sung-hoon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes, which had been scanning the crowd with cold calculation, flickered with something that might have been concern. "Find her," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made men move mountains. "Gently. If anyone touches her, break their hand." "Understood, sir." He looked down, searching the glittering sea of heads for the small, fragile figure of his mother, Kim Seo-yeon. She was 68 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia that was advancing faster than the doctors wanted to admit. Most days she believed she was still a 19-year-old seamstress in Busan, embroidering silk for wedding ceremonies. Some days she called for her own mother, dead for 30 years. The doctors had advised against bringing her to public events. Too many triggers, they said. Too much confusion. Too much risk. But 2 weeks ago she had cried. She had gripped his hand with surprising strength and begged, actually begged, to see the pretty lights and hear the music one more time. She had hummed an old folk song while choosing her dress from her closet, selecting a deep navy velvet gown with pearl earrings, moving like a ghost through memories that no longer quite belonged to her. He couldn't say no to her. He never could. Down on the ballroom floor, the atmosphere was suffocating for Mildred Fletcher. She adjusted the heavy silver tray of canapés balanced on her left palm, her arms aching from 10 hours of standing. She was 28 years old, though exhaustion had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. Her uniform, A generic black dress and white apron provided by the staffing agency was a size too large, pinned awkwardly at the waist with safety pins she'd borrowed from the kitchen. Her shoes, which had cost her $30 at a discount outlet in Itaewon, were beginning to separate at the sole. She had learned not to notice things like that. She had learned to make herself into a ghost. Champagne? Canopy? She murmured, weaving through the crowd with practiced invisibility. To these people she was a prop, a function, a uniform that held food. She had done this work in Seoul for 4 years on a visa that had technically expired 18 months ago. A fact she didn't advertise and her employers pretended not to know. The staffing agency paid her $28 an hour under the table. Rent in her tiny Gangnam Gazawan was $800 a month. Her grandmother in Atlanta needed heart medication that insurance wouldn't cover. Her visa situation meant no legitimate job, no bank account, no safety net. Every hour she stood in this ballroom mattered. Her eyes, trained by years of invisibility, caught everything. The way the older Korean women assessed each other's jewelry, the way the younger men positioned themselves near the city's most powerful figures, the way money created a kind of electricity in the air that the poor could feel but never quite touch. Near the center of the ballroom, close to the chocolate fountain, a commotion began to ripple through the crowd. The low hum of sophisticated conversation spiked into something sharper. Whispers. The quick intake of breath that precedes judgment. Mildred's training kicked in automatically. She turned, her eyes assessing, her body ready to move toward whatever crisis might mean she'd lose this shift's pay. She saw an elderly woman in a vintage, slightly out-of-style velvet gown, stumbling near the fountain. The woman's silver hair, once neatly pinned, was coming loose. Her eyes were wide and terrified, searching for something or someone that wasn't there. She was clutching a small beaded purse like a lifeline, like it was the only solid thing in a world that no longer made sense. The crowd parted around her, not to help, but to avoid contamination. Standing directly in the elderly woman's path was Rosemary Richardson. Rosemary was 45 years old and had spent considerable money to look 35. Her face had been pulled tight by surgeons who understood that wealth could purchase youth, even if it couldn't purchase warmth. Her cream-colored designer suit probably cost more than Mildred made in 2 months. Pearl necklace, pearl earrings. The kind of woman who had never worried about money and therefore had never developed the capacity for empathy. She was holding a glass of red wine, laughing loudly at a joke someone had made, completely unaware that her trajectory and the elderly woman's trajectory were about to collide. The elderly woman, confused by the lights, the noise, the overwhelming sensory assault of a room full of strangers, reached out instinctively. "Mateo," she whispered, mistaking a passing waiter for someone from her past, someone from a world that no longer existed. She stumbled. Her hand flailed and struck Rosemary's arm. The glass of red wine tipped. For a moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The liquid caught the golden light of the chandeliers, transforming into a ruby arc through the air. The wine splashed across Rosemary's cream suit, spreading like blood through silk, destroying something that cost more than Mildred's entire annual salary in a single irreversible moment. The silence that followed was absolute. Rosemary looked down at her ruined suit. Then she looked at the elderly Korean woman standing before her, confused and terrified and utterly helpless. And Rosemary's face twisted into something cruel. "You stupid old woman," she hissed, her voice loud enough to carry across the ballroom. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs? Do you have any idea how much you just destroyed?" The elderly woman's face crumpled. I'm sorry," she whispered, her Korean accent thick with panic. "I didn't mean." "Of course you didn't mean to," Rosemary said, her voice dripping with contempt. "People like you never mean to. You just stumble through life ruining things, contaminating spaces where you don't belong." Mildred watched it happen. Watched the crowd's collective intake of breath. Watched the way the other Korean elites in the room looked away, suddenly very interested in their champagne flutes, their shoes, anything but the elderly woman being systematically humiliated in front of 300 people. And Mildred saw her grandmother. Not her real grandmother in Atlanta, though that woman's face flashed through her mind, but her own future if she wasn't careful. The way society could decide you were disposable. The way it could happen in public in front of witnesses, and no one would intervene because intervening cost something. It cost your job. Cost your visa. It cost your safety in a world that had already decided you didn't matter. Rosemary's voice cut through the noise again. Get her out of here. Get this pathetic creature away from me. That's when Mildred made a choice that would change everything. She set down her tray of canapés on the nearest table, an action so deliberate, so final, that it felt like setting down a weapon. She moved through the crowd with the same invisibility that had protected her for 4 years. Except now she wasn't moving away. She was moving toward. She reached the elderly woman just as Rosemary raised her hand, her voice rising to deliver another cruelty. Another blow designed to make sure everyone in the room understood the hierarchy. Mildred caught her arm. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her American accent cutting through the Korean being spoken around them. "But you're going to stop talking now." Rosemary turned, her face flushing with outrage at being contradicted by someone in a uniform with holes in her shoes. She opened her mouth to respond, but from the mezzanine balcony high above, Lee Sung-hoon had stopped breathing. The chandelier light at the Shilla Hotel Gala didn't sparkle. It glared. For Mildred Fletcher, the brilliance only served to highlight every bead of sweat on her brow, and the ache in her feet that had long since turned into a dull, pulsing throb. She moved through the crowd like a ghost in a polyester uniform, one of 3 black faces in a sea of porcelain skin and silk, unnoticed until someone needed a refill. Then came the sound of shattering glass, a sharp, violent crack that silenced the room. Kim Seo-yeon stood trembling, her frail hands hovering in the air as if trying to catch the red wine now blossoming like a wound across Rosemary Richardson's cream designer suit. Seo-yeon's eyes were wide, clouded by the fog of dementia that often left her untethered from time. "You stupid, clumsy old woman." Rosemary's voice sliced through the silence, dripping with a venom that made the air feel cold. "Do you have any idea what this costs? More than you'll make in a lifetime of scrubbing floors." Rosemary didn't stop at the dress. The humiliation was calculated. She stepped forward, looming over the elderly Korean woman, demanding an apology on bended knee. The xenophobic slurs that followed were quiet but jagged, mocking Seo-yeon's heritage in a room filled with her own countrymen. Yet the elite crowd remained frozen, a gallery of silent complicity, eyes averted to their own reflection in champagne flutes. Mildred watched from the periphery, her heart hammering against her ribs. In Seo-yeon's terrified, watery eyes she didn't see a stranger. She saw her own grandmother, a woman who had spent her life bending so others could stand tall. As Rosemary raised her arm, a fresh glass of Cabernet aimed at the elderly woman's face, Mildred moved. She didn't think. She simply existed in the space between the predator and the prey. The wine hit Mildred's shoulder instead, the dark liquid soaking into her white uniform, but she didn't flinch. She caught Seo-yeon's shaking frame, pulling the woman against her side. "That's enough," Mildred said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a quiet fury that stopped Rosemary mid-breath. "Move, girl," Rosemary hissed, her face contorting. "I'll have you fired. I'll have you deported before the sun comes up. Do you know who I am?" Mildred tightened her grip on Seo-yeon, feeling the woman's heart racing like a trapped bird. She looked Rosemary directly in the eye, refusing to blink, refusing to be invisible for 1 second longer. "I know exactly who you are," Mildred replied, her voice steady and cold. "And you're not laying another hand on her." The silence that followed Mildred's defiance was brittle, but it shattered completely when a rhythmic heavy tread echoed from the grand staircase. Lee Sung-hoon descended with the slow, predatory grace of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. His presence acted like a vacuum, sucking the noise and the very pretense of the gala out of the room. Rosemary Richardson, sensing a change in the atmosphere, turned with a triumphant smirk, likely expecting a peer to join her crusade. But as her eyes met Sung-hoon's cold, obsidian gaze, her smugness evaporated. Her face went ashen, the color of her ruined cream suit, as she recognized the man whose family name was etched into the skyline of Seoul. Sung-hoon ignored her entirely at first. He stepped into the circle of wreckage, his focus locked on the two women standing at its center. To the shock of the watching elite, he reached out and took hold of the wine-soaked fabric at Mildred's shoulder. His touch was surprisingly careful, almost reverent, as he inspected the damage the Cabernet had done to her uniform. For a heartbeat, the exhaustion Mildred had carried all night vanished, replaced by the sheer, grounding weight of his attention. Then he turned to Rosemary. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. "You have mistaken a gala for a gutter, Mrs. Richardson," he said, his voice a low, lethal silk. "This woman is my mother. And the woman standing in your way is the only person in this room with a shred of dignity." Rosemary began to stammer a frantic apology, her hands trembling, but Sung-hoon cut her off with a slight raise of his chin. "By tomorrow morning, your husband's credit lines will be frozen. By noon, your family's holdings will be liquidated. You are no longer a guest in this city. You are a ghost." The room exhaled a collective gasp. It wasn't just a threat. It was a clinical observation of a future he was currently creating. Rosemary stood frozen, her social standing and her life's work dissolving into the floorboards alongside the spilled wine. Without a second glance at the wreckage of the woman's life, Sung-hoon slid his bespoke suit jacket from his shoulders. He draped it around Mildred, the silk lining still warm from his body, shielding her stained uniform from the prying eyes of the crowd. With his other arm he reached for Seo-yun, tucking the elderly woman's frail hand into the crook of his elbow. He didn't wait for permission. He simply led them both toward the exit, a pillar of quiet strength between a maid and a mother. As they walked out, the elite crowd parted like a retreating tide, leaving them to move through a hall of stunned, absolute silence. The interior of the armored Mercedes was a tomb of leather and silence. Mildred sat stiffly, the expensive silk of Sung-hoon's jacket still draped over her shoulders, feeling like a counterfeit queen. As the city lights blurred past the reinforced glass, the weight of the situation finally crashed down. She knew who he was now, not just a wealthy man but the Lee Sung-hoon, a titan whose shadow reached across oceans. "Let me out," she whispered, her hand fumbling for the door handle. "Please. I appreciate the help, but I can't be involved in whatever this is." Sung-hoon didn't look at her. He was busy adjusting the blanket over his mother, who had finally drifted into a fitful sleep. "You owe 4 months of back rent, Mildred. Your grandmother's dialysis in Atlanta is 3 weeks behind on payments. And your visa expired exactly 12 days ago." Mildred froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "How do you? I know the contents of your bank account and the dreams you hide in your nursing textbooks," he interrupted, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with power. "I am offering you a way out. Become my mother's full-time companion. $15,000 a month. Your own suite in my residence, full health care, and absolute protection." The number made Mildred's head spin. It was more than she earned in a year of backbreaking shifts. But the invasion of her life felt like a violation. "You stalked me." "I vetted a potential asset," he corrected coldly. "I saw how you looked at her. You saw a human being when everyone else saw an inconvenience. That is a rare commodity." "My status," Mildred stammered, the fear of deportation always a low-grade fever in her mind. "If I'm caught, my lawyers will have your papers processed by Monday. You will be untouchable." He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "All I require is that you keep her safe. From the world and from her own mind." Mildred felt the walls closing in. A choice between a slow death by poverty or a fast life in a gilded cage. "I have conditions," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "I finish my nursing degree online. No interruptions. And I won't be part of whatever violence your world entails. I won't look the other way if people get hurt." A ghost of a smirk touched Sung-hoon's lips. "Agreed. My mother is the only person you answer to." Give her your absolute loyalty, and I will give you the world. He produced a sleek tablet with a digital contract already loaded. Mildred stared at the glowing screen. She was signing away her anonymity to a man who broke families for breakfast, but as she thought of her grandmother and the cold reality of the streets, she pressed her finger to the glass. The deal was sealed in light and shadow. The Lee estate was less a home and more a cathedral of glass and silent judgment. For 4 weeks, Mildred lived within its fortified walls, where the air smelled of floor wax and expensive ozone. It was a world of sharp angles and surveillance cameras that tracked her every movement, a modern fortress where even the shadows seemed to be on the payroll. Despite the coldness of the architecture, life began to bloom in the orchid garden. Under Mildred's steady hand, Seo-yun flourished. The elderly woman's lucidity stretched like a lingering sunset, her eyes clearing as she guided Mildred's fingers through the delicate task of pruning. Between the flowers, they traded languages. Seo-yun taught her the soft, round vowels of Korean, laughing gently when Mildred's tongue tripped over the honorifics. In those moments, the high-tension wires of the estate seemed to go slack. Navigating the household, however, required the skill of a minesweeper. Park, the head of security, watched Mildred with a suspicion that felt like a physical weight, his eyes lingering on her skin as if her presence were a security breach he hadn't yet solved. There was a subtle biting friction from some of the domestic staff, muttered remarks in the kitchen that didn't need a translation to be understood as colored by prejudice. Yet there were unexpected counterweights. A young maid who slipped extra ginger tea onto Mildred's tray, or the gardener who bowed just a second longer than protocol required. Sung-hoon himself was a ghost in his own house. He was gone before the mist lifted from the hills and returned long after Mildred had tucked Seo-yun into bed. His presence was felt not in footfalls, but in the silent machinery of his power. Mildred would return to her suite to find her nursing textbooks replaced by leather-bound volumes on Korean history. A brief, cold email from Atlanta confirmed her grandmother's debt had been wiped clean, not just paid but erased. Her visa, once a source of terror, was now a gold-sealed reality sitting on her desk. It was through Seo-yun's stories that the phantom began to take on a human shape. Over tea, the older woman spoke not of the titan who broke companies, but of a boy who used to hide his lunch to give to the stray dogs behind their tenement, a son who had carried the weight of a dying father's legacy since he was 19. Mildred listened, looking at the security cameras and the cold stone walls, wondering if the man she served was a monster who had built a cage, or a boy who had simply built a shield. The storm outside battered the estate's reinforced glass, the thunder a low rhythmic growl that matched the unease in Mildred's chest. Unable to sleep, she retreated to the kitchen, the heart of the house now cold and cavernous in the blue light of the appliances. She was startled to find Sung-hoon there, slumped over the marble island. His tie was undone, his jacket discarded, the impenetrable armor of the Lee legacy finally showing its seams. He didn't move as she prepared a pot of barley tea, the silence between them thick but surprisingly soft. When she set a cup before him, he looked up, his eyes bloodshot and heavy with a weariness that went deeper than bone. "She asked for you today," he murmured, his voice raspy. "In her sleep." "She's happy, Sung-hoon," Mildred said, taking a seat opposite him. "But she's a prisoner. This house. The guards, the cameras. You've built a beautiful cage, but it's still a cage." Sung-hoon's gaze sharpened, the exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by a grim reality. "It is a fortress because it has to be. Do you think I enjoy the silence of this tomb?" He leaned forward, the steam from the tea curling between them. "A rival syndicate, men who see human lives as line items, has put a price on my head. To them, my mother is not a woman, she is a lever. And you," he reached into his pocket, sliding a handful of grainy surveillance photos across the marble, "are now the same." Mildred's stomach dropped as she looked at the images. They were from the night of the gala, the moment she had stepped between Seo-yun and the wine, the moment she had looked into the camera without knowing it. "They have seen you," he whispered. "They have seen that you are the only person I have allowed into her orbit. By saving her that night, You stepped into a war you didn't know existed. The air in the kitchen shifted, the professional distance between them collapsing into something uncomfortably intimate. Mildred felt the heat of his presence, a magnetic pull that made her breath hitch. He stood, moving around the island until he was inches away. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of her sleeve where the wine stains had once been. His touch a searing contrast to the cold storm outside. "You are a vulnerability, Mildred," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "But you are mine. You are under my protection now, and I do not lose what belongs to me." The tension snapped tight, his eyes searching hers with a raw, unspoken hunger. But before the distance could close, the kitchen door swung open with a violent click. Park stood there, his face a mask of tactical urgency. "Sir," the head of security barked, "the thermal sensors on the north perimeter have been tripped. We have movement." The transition from the quiet kitchen to the cacophony of war happened in a heartbeat. A florist delivery van, a Trojan horse cloaked in mundane camouflage, slammed through the side gate just as the guards rotated shifts. The storm outside was drowned out by the rhythmic, percussive crack of suppressed gunfire. Sung-hoon didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mildred's arm, his grip bruising as he dragged her through the darkened corridors toward his private study. "Stay down and do not move," he commanded, shoving her behind a heavy mahogany desk just as the sound of splintering would echoed through the hall. The reinforced door of the study groaned under a barrage of bullets, the wood weeping splinters before it was kicked off its hinges. 3 men in tactical gear stormed in, their silhouettes jagged against the emergency red lights. Sung-hoon met them with a brutal, clinical efficiency that turned the refined executive into a shadow of death. He moved with the terrifying speed of a man who had been forged in violence, disarming the first attacker and using him as a shield while taking out the second. But as he moved to neutralize the third, the man barked into his radio, "We have the old woman. Stop or she dies now." Sung-hoon froze, his hand around the throat of the man he held, his eyes wide with the sudden, paralyzing terror. The gunman in the doorway leveled his weapon at Sung-hoon's chest, a cruel sneer visible under his mask. Mildred's heart wasn't just racing. It was screaming. She looked at the heavy ancient ceramic vase on the side table, a relic Seo-yun had once told her was a family heirloom. Without a second of calculation, Mildred lunged from behind the desk. She swung the heavy porcelain with the ferocity of a woman who had nothing left to lose, shattering it directly across the gunman's temple. The man crumpled, his rifle clattering to the floor. Sung-hoon stared at Mildred, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the shattered fragments of his history on the floor, then at the gentle caregiver who now stood over an assassin with a jagged piece of porcelain gripped in her trembling hand. She looked like a lioness protecting a cub. "Mildred," he whispered, a flash of genuine shock breaking through his mask. "We have to get to her," she hissed, her voice shaking but her eyes iron-willed. They fought their way through the smoke-choked halls to the grand foyer. There the nightmare took shape. A man in a sharp gray suit, the syndicate lieutenant, stood on the marble staircase. He held a sobbing, confused Seo-yun by the throat, the barrel of a chrome handgun pressed against her silver hair. "The shipping routes, Sung-hoon," the man shouted over the dying echoes of the sirens. "Sign them over, or watch your mother's blood stain the marble you're so proud of." The foyer was an altar of cold marble and spilled blood, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the lieutenant's predatory laughter. Sung-hoon stood at the base of the stairs, his body coiled like a spring, yet his eyes were wide with a rare, suffocating helplessness. "Take me!" Mildred's voice broke the deadlock. She stepped forward, her hands raised, her gaze locked on the lieutenant. "The old woman is useless to you. She's confused, she's fragile. She'll die before you get her out the door. But I'm young, I'm strong, and you've seen how much he values me." The lieutenant's eyes flickered with a dark, appreciative glint. He saw the way Sung-hoon's jaw tightened, the way the Titan's composure fractured at the mere suggestion. He didn't see a lover. He saw a symbol of the humanity Sung-hoon had tried to bury, now standing vulnerable in the light. An upgrade, the lieutenant sneered, shoving Seo-yun toward the stairs and pulling Mildred into a chokehold, a serrated knife biting into the dark skin of her throat. But Mildred Fletcher was not a victim. She was a girl from the west side of Atlanta who had survived things far more visceral than a man in a suit. As the lieutenant's grip tightened, the estate's defense surged. Park appeared on the mezzanine, the red dot of a sniper rifle dancing across the lieutenant's brow. In that split second of distraction, Mildred drove her elbow into the man's solar plexus and used a hip toss that sent him sprawling. Sung-hoon moved with a lethal, terrifying grace, vaulting over the banister to finish what Mildred had started. But the air turned cold as the household doctor, the woman who had tended to Seo-yun for years, stepped out from the shadows with a silenced pistol aimed at the elderly woman's heart. "Enough," the doctor hissed, her betrayal a jagged blade. "The routes are mine." She leveled the gun, but she had underestimated the clumsy old woman. Seo-yun's eyes weren't clouded with dementia, they were burning with a mother's protective fury. From the folds of her silk robe, she drew the heavy gardening shears Mildred had lost days earlier. With a cry that sounded like an ancient war, Seo-yun lunged, burying the steel blades into the traitor's thigh. The doctor screamed, the shot going wide into the ceiling. Sung-hoon was there in an instant, neutralizing the threat with a finality that left the room in a ringing silence. Among the bodies and the wreckage of his home, Sung-hoon turned to Mildred. He didn't speak. He reached out, his hands trembling as he pulled her into him. He kissed her amid the carnage, a kiss that tasted of copper and adrenaline, a desperate claim of survival, possession, and something terrifyingly close to love. The first thing Mildred noticed wasn't the pain but the silence. It wasn't the heavy, watchful silence of the estate, but the sterile, rhythmic hum of a private medical suite. When she finally forced her eyes open, the world was a blur of white linen and the ghost of a headache that throbbed behind her temples. Beside her, Sung-hoon sat slumped in a chair. The Titan looked broken. He was unshaven, his eyes hollowed out by exhaustion, and he was still wearing the white dress shirt from the night of the breach, now stiff with dried blood that wasn't his. When he saw her stir, he leaned forward, his hand hovering over hers as if afraid she might shatter. 3 days, he rasped, his voice a ghost of its usual authority. The doctor said you hit the marble with enough force to kill a lesser woman. The blade. It missed your carotid artery by 3 millimeters, Mildred. 3. Mildred tried to speak, her throat feeling like it had been scraped with glass. Seo-yun. Safe. She hasn't left the garden. She says the flowers need more light for you to see them when you wake. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. Mildred recognized it instantly. The digital contract she had signed in the back of the Mercedes. Without a word, he gripped the edges and tore it into jagged pieces, letting them flutter onto the hospital bed like snow. "That was an insult," he said, his voice trembling with a raw, unshielded vulnerability. "I watched the footage. I watched you step into the path of a knife for a woman who isn't your blood, for a man who tried to own you. I don't want a caregiver, Mildred. And I don't want an asset." He took her hand then, his grip firm and warm. "I want a partner. Someone who stands beside me, not in the shadows I cast. I want the woman who broke a centuries-old vase over an assassin's head." Mildred looked at the torn paper, then up at the man who had systematically dismantled her life only to rebuild it in gold. "If I stay," she whispered, her voice gaining strength, "it's on my terms. No more secrets. No more vetting my life without my permission. And you stop looking at me as something you need to protect like a piece of art in a vault. I am not your property, Sung-hoon." Sung-hoon bowed his head, a silent surrender that felt more powerful than any of his commands. "I was terrified," he admitted, the confession sounding like a prayer. "I have spent my life building walls so I would never have to feel that kind of fear again. But seeing you offer yourself, it broke me." He looked at her then, the predator finally tamed by the lioness. "Everything you ask for is yours. Just don't leave me in the silence again." The chandelier light at the Shilla Hotel Gala still glared, But tonight, it didn't feel like a spotlight of judgment. 6 months had passed since the wine stain had changed the trajectory of her life, and as Mildred Lee stood at the top of the grand staircase, she was no longer a ghost in polyester. She descended with a quiet, grounded power, wearing a gown that was a masterpiece of defiance and grace. The fabric was a deep, regal indigo, blending the structured elegance of a Korean hanbok with the vibrant, bold geometry of African wax prints. Her natural curls were swept up, adorned with intricate jade and gold bigneo pins that shimmered with every step. The silence that greeted her wasn't the terrified vacuum of Sung-hoon's arrival, but a stunned, respectful hush. The elite of Seoul watched as the woman they had once looked through became the woman they could not look away from. In the corner of the ballroom, Mildred spotted a familiar face. Rosemary Richardson stood near the buffet, her designer dress a season old, her social standing visible only in the way people avoided her gaze. When their eyes met, Rosemary scrambled forward, her voice a desperate, frantic pitch. "Mildred, Mrs. Lee. I've wanted to explain, to apologize for that unfortunate misunderstanding." Mildred stopped, but she didn't gloat. She looked at the woman with a calm, dismissive pity that cut deeper than any insult. "Some people never grow, Rosemary," Mildred said softly. "I'm focused on building a future, not looking back at the shadows. I hope you find peace." She walked away before the apology could even finish, her attention caught by a scene near the service entrance. A young maid from a rural province was being hissed at by a head waiter, her accent mocked and her background ridiculed. Mildred saw the familiar slump of the girl's shoulders, the way she tried to become invisible. Mildred didn't hesitate. She approached the girl, ignoring the waiter's frantic bowing. "I need someone with a kind heart to spend time with my mother-in-law in the afternoons," Mildred told her, her voice warm and steady. "She values sincerity over status. Would you like to come work for the Lee residence?" As the girl's eyes widened with hope, Mildred realized she was no longer just a survivor. She was an architect. She was building a network of the overlooked and the underestimated, turning a fortress of glass into a home of purpose. Sung-hoon watched her from across the room. He wasn't scanning the perimeter for threats or calculating shipping routes. His gaze was anchored entirely on his wife, his face softened by a complete, unshakable adoration. Mildred had given him more than protection. She had given him peace. As they met in the center of the ballroom, he took her hand and led her into a slow dance under the golden lights. They were two people from different worlds who had survived the dark to find the light in each other. It was a reminder that true power doesn't lie in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to stand for the vulnerable. Single acts of bravery can indeed transform destinies, proving that even in the coldest worlds, light finds a way in when someone is brave enough to carry it.